A note before we start, this episode deals with issues of child sex abuse, violence, and the recounting of traumatic events. Listener discretion is advised. When Tess Knight came home from work on an August afternoon in 1986, her Bondi unit was quieter than usual. The remnants of a snack sat on the kitchen bench, one that looked abruptly abandoned by her 9-year-old daughter, Samantha. It wasn't unusual that Samantha wasn't at home. She likely went to a friend's house or was out playing on the street. But as the sun set, Samantha, with her long blonde hair and deep green eyes, never did come home. It would be decades before Tess, and Australia more broadly, would learn what exactly had happened to Samantha Knight. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, we're speaking to Daily Telegraph journalist and author Mark Morri, who was one of the lead reporters to break the story about missing Bondi schoolgirl Samantha Knight. He joins us to walk through the case and into the mind of the perpetrator, who claims to be the only person who knows where 9-year-old Samantha is. So it's 1986, August the 19th, and Tess Knight gets home from work and her 9-year-old daughter Samantha wasn't there. Was she immediately concerned that something was wrong, or was that sort of something that was a bit common?
I don't think the panic button was hit straight away. 9-year-old girl, Bondi, and it's the 80s. Everyone was a little bit freer around then. There was not the great fear that we have now, and the hovering that parents tend to do now. She was a single mother, so it wasn't immediate. But I think by the next day, things were really starting to get very, very concerned, and the police were very concerned. But they did go there that night, if I recall, initially.
And what was her first step? Did she ask neighbours? Did she ask friends that Samantha might have gone and hung out with a neighbour or something? Was that?
I think that all those avenues were explored. Tess would have done all of that before contacting the police. As I said, it was a little bit different. It's a beachside suburb. Everyone's a little bit more relaxed back there about children, and I don't think we thought that there was a pedophile behind every telegraph pole.
And what kind of family situation was there? Because you were saying that Tess was a single parent. So had Samantha's parents divorced years before? Is that correct?
Yeah, they separated quite early. So Tess had been living in Bronte and they moved, and then were living in Imperial Avenue at Bondi, and that's where she was when she went missing. And I remember about a week later going and interview Tess after the disappearance, and she'd already been missing, I think, a week. I'm not really sure. It's a long time ago. And I remember it was at night. I was working night shift for a paper called the Daily Mirror, and it was extreme in those days, the competition between the papers. It's like what you see in England now. It was really the Sun versus the Mirror, and everybody was trying to get the big story. And I remember going into the block of flats in Imperial Avenue, and I remember Tess opening the door, and what struck me was the rings under her eyes. It looked like she hadn't slept for a week. It was really quite confronting. And she let me in and we talked. I can't remember a real lot about what she said, but I do remember that we got a photo album, and that's where you can see that iconic photo of Samantha with the cap. And I think the fact that she looked so innocent too, and we just, we ran it all over page one, I think that just sent Sydney even into more of a spin that they could see this young girl. And by then, it was pretty obvious she hadn't just run away. 9-year-olds can't survive that long. Sydney went into quite a frenzy about after that.
Can you remember, was there hysteria around where this girl was?
There was. Every telegraph pole, every available shop front had those photos of Samantha everywhere. It was just the story that consumed the city as well as the media. It was, I felt sorry for the mother. She was, just hounded. But likewise, she realised that was the best chance of trying to find Samantha, was to have this publicity blitz. And as I said, she was never found. It was, it was just the torment for all those years.
When you laid eyes on Michael Guider, can you describe your thoughts and your feelings at that point?
It was interesting. I didn't feel anything.
Didn't generate any sort of emotion in you at that time?
No, not his presence. I think that there was such a length of time while we were waiting to find out who he was and what happened, that he was a presence in my inner landscape, if you like.
Did you look into his eyes at that time at any stage, in court or anything like that?
Guider never looks in anyone's eyes if he can help it.
Were you, as a journalist, getting any tips about what might have happened or sightings, or do people contact you about that stuff?
Especially back then, yeah, you'd get people ringing in constantly trying to tell you that they saw her and trying to sell the story. Police were constantly doing it. You get clairvoyance saying, we know where she's near water. All that type of thing was happening. That was frequently getting those sort of phone calls, and none of them were correct. And some of them were just mischief-making, which is really, really horrible when you think of what was at stake. So we didn't heed very many of them, but you had to listen occasionally, and you'd pass them on to police a lot of the time, and they'd have to follow them up because they were desperate. They would follow up anything at this stage because, I think they knew that their likelihood of finding her alive after a while had gone. In these situations, the first inkling that police think is that it was perhaps domestic. When there's split families, they think that maybe one of the parents is taken because they want custody or they want the child. The father, I can't really remember. I think he kept very much in the background. So that avenue, once that was all exhausted, that's when the manhunt would have become very, very intense.
And was there any evidence? So when they actually went into the house, it looked like she'd half eaten a snack or something. Was there any evidence that she'd been abducted or that she'd walked down the street? Did police have anything?
No, I think they really thought she was last seen at some shops, and that was it. They couldn't find evidence that she'd been forcibly taken. No one had seen her in the company of anybody. So they really were just at a total loss, a dead end. And the forensics that we have now weren't available back then. It was 1986. And the CCTV footage, like nowadays, they would be capturing her up and down Bondi Road every moment, and the eventual person that was caught would have probably been seen, or a registration would have popped up. But back then, there was nothing. So they had some vague accounts that she'd been seen around the area buying an ice cream or something like that. But they had no hard evidence or witnesses to say she had been abducted.
I was immediately alarmed. She wasn't where she was supposed to be with who she was supposed to be with.
Now, I want to go back to a few months or a few years. What had happened was that she'd gone to a friend's house and something awful had happened, which would later come out. What had happened that not even Samantha's parents knew about? I
think it was at the home of a friend, and I think they were molested and drugged, I believe, and that was what turned out to be the modus operandi of the person who eventually pleaded guilty to manslaughter of Samantha. And I think one of those victims, the girl, is now the one who's fighting incredibly hard to make sure that the man who killed Samantha is not going to be released from prison.
Did any of those girls tell their mothers?
No. From what I can gather, it was kept a secret for so long. A lot of the detail didn't come out until nearly 2 decades, at least 15 years later, when Michael Guider, who was eventually jailed, provided some of the information, and I think then the woman started to tell what had happened.
So it was just one time I was staying at my friend's house and he was there.
Did your mum meet him?
Yes. She says after the fact, she just said he gave her a bad feeling. I think it was one of those things where you second guess your bad feeling and you push it aside, and she just did and dismissed it. Like the minute my mum left, the whole mood shifted. That's when, dirty magazines were on the coffee table all of a sudden, and he was like setting a mood.
What were the theories when you were reporting that in the early days? I imagine that some theories started to emerge about who might have done it or where she could have gone. Was there anything about a pedophile in the area that came up, or were people pretty much clueless?
They went through, it was really clueless. But it was obvious that she had been taken. Whether she had been murdered No one knew. There was no body. There was no clothing found. So there were wild theories that, snatched and taken overseas by slave trade or pedophile rings. That was a theory that would go around, and then there'd be others that she just had been taken by a random deviant.
Would you compare it to Madeleine McCann in terms of the...
Publicity?
Yeah.
Well, yes. She's photogenic. I mean, that's a horrible thing to say, but she was photogenic, and there were these lovely photos. And in fact, what was quite horrible was there were a few people saying, oh, look at the way she's dressed. Some of the photos, they were saying, oh, she's provocative, dressed too old for a 9-year-old, which must have hurt the mother terribly. It was this insinuation, oh, well, she was asking to be picked up and grabbed. All those avenues about pedophiles and that, they were all looked at. There were people talking about them. But really, no one had any idea. None.
So as you say, years went by without anyone knowing, and a body doesn't turn up, and there at this point appears to be absolutely no evidence. But then in the early 2000s, a name actually does come up, and it's Michael Guider. Can you remember what that was like when there was a break in the case like this, and what sort of stories were coming out at the time?
I can't really. There's been so many, and because another story around the same time, which I only just realised could be linked, was Renee Aitken, which I covered a lot. I'm not sure when that was, but I remember going down there and talking to the mother. I know one of the investigators very, very, very well. So, and then later I find out that Michael Guider was in fact a suspect in Renee Aitken's disappearance, and again has never been found. Her body. Finally, the news started breaking for the Samantha. I vaguely just remember, I think I got beaten on it, so I'm probably blanking it out a bit. But it was massive news because it was decades later. And I suppose for a lot of people, we had to refresh their memory about who Samantha Knight was. It was, a whole generation had passed. But, I think recently we've gone back and talked to some of her school friends, and they're still affected. They were only 9, but their school friend had gone missing, and that still impacted years later. So when this came up again, and I think it was, for them, it would have been fantastic to get some answers. Some of the original police who worked on it, unfortunately, were dead, because I know that it would have really haunted them. Disappearances of children, the murder of children, are the ones that really stick with police. I know it brings many of them undone or sends them basically mad if they can't find or get justice. So when it finally broke, I think around 2000, it was massive news. A reinvestigation to look into it had been ordered by the head of the homicide squad at the time, Nick Caldos. And then that's when they re-looked at Guider and got him to confess, basically. He was already in jail, I think, on a horrendously high number of indecent assaults on young children. And that's when he admitted and said that he had drugged Samantha with Normison, I think it was, to take photos of her. That was his special sort of deviousness. And she woke up and he gave her another dose and accidentally killed her. Now, that's what he says. And then the body was put into Cooper Park up at Bellevue Hill. That's what he claims. And then he moved it and put it in a dumpster at near the Royal Yacht Club, I think. So the body's never been found. They've looked and they've never found it. And I've spoken to some detectives since, and they said they'll never find. They think what might have happened is if it did go in the dumpster, like he said, could end up being landfill. And you've got to remember that she would have been bits and pieces and horribly degraded by that time. So it would be very hard to find her if it was landfill.
A man with a sordid history of sexual depravity finally faced justice.
I met Samantha on 2 or 3 occasions, but I can't really remember It wasn't an association at all, really.
Did the court accept that it was an accident like Guider said? Did they sort of take him at his word with that?
Because he had a guilty plea, so it didn't have to go to a jury. He was, he pled guilty to manslaughter. I think police thought that was the best result. There was no body, there was no evidence, so they couldn't contradict his story. I think they were quite happy that in fact they had got some admission from him, and that they could actually put him in jail for a lot longer again. I think he got quite an extension on his already what he was serving. It never went to a jury, so they had to accept the manslaughter and the accident theory. Whether they'd be happy with that, probably not, but I think they decided that one in the hand was better than, charging him with murder. And if he'd pled not guilty, well, it's very hard to get successful prosecutions without a body. So, and that would have also given him a chance to recant and go, well, no. And even now he's actually recanting. He's basically saying, so he's lied, about where the body is. I know there's a movement to say killers with missing bodies can't be released until they... No, but in this case, to be fair, I think he's told them what happened. And I think the body, if he was even telling the truth, the body couldn't be found anyway because it's probably been scattered around. He's got away with murder, probably, and he's now ready to be released, which is a frightening thought because he's just been a pedophile all his life. But obviously very, very clever to be able to manipulate vulnerable women into letting him look after their children. And then again with the children to be able to do what he was able to do and get away with it for quite some time. As I said, I'll never forget seeing Tess Knight, that week later. Just the look on her face, it was terrible. And the thought that maybe she's alive would just linger, So that's probably, a murder, a body's found, you get to process everything. But when your child's just missing, it'd just be... No, the equivalent now, the William Tyrrell is your generation of Samantha Knight.
Yeah.
It is the big mystery, and it took, 15 years before I think there was some answers for Tess Knight about her daughter. I know the police will never stop looking for William Tyrrell. The amount of publicity that you're seeing for William Tyrrell, Madeleine McCann, Samantha Knight was very, very close to it. It was frenetic. TV cameras and
the images of Tess Knight, because I've looked at pictures and there's just a look in her eye that you just can't. Yeah. It's almost like they've experienced a death in terms of the level of mourning. Yeah. And what you said about her eyes, it honestly looks like she hasn't slept.
Well, she hadn't, and as I said, I do remember the unit was in darkness, so I think she'd just been sitting, no TV or anything, or obviously just sitting, and the rings under her eyes were just, so they confronting me, hit me. And, you sometimes think, I don't really want to hurt this lady, but, she knew and she said, here's some more photos, please, just put them in the paper. It might just help. And as I said, the photos of her with that cap that's the one that haunts me. You just look at her and just go, who could hurt?
Yeah.
Someone so young and innocent, and you could just see that she was just a happy-go-lucky kid, to think that maybe what had happened. And I still don't know whether God is telling the truth. That it'd be nice to think that she just passed away from an overdose and just went quietly like that.
He used a drug called Normicin, which was a drug only available to adults. He carried that with him a lot of the time in a Coke bottle filled with Coke. Once he had access to the children, he would just give them a drink. And that drug was strong enough to knock them out.
And we do know that he used those sorts of drugs, and then there were images found, I believe, of the girls that he used to take, and one of them could be Samantha Knight, but it's never been identified, which would also be difficult, I suppose, as a parent. But he was sentenced 17 years ago, and now, as you say, it's looking like he could be out. What are your thoughts on that, having seen the look on Tess Knight's face?
And speaking to lots of experts over the years about pedophiles, it's almost incurable unless, massive amounts of counselling, medication to almost medically castrate them are the only things that seem to work. You've got to remember with Guida, the other really frightening thing is he didn't go for early release for parole. And what that means, there's a misconception, a lot of people, when someone's released 2 years early on parole, we have outrage. But when you're on parole, you have conditions, reporting conditions, not allowed to go near drugs, alcohol. The parole officer can come and visit you, you've got to do that. If you finish your sentence and you're not on parole, you walk out the gate, that's it. He did not go for parole, which means he didn't want to have any sort of conditions. He didn't want to have the authorities knowing anything about him. That's the scary thought, because that to me makes me think this guy knows. He knows the system, and he knows that if he got parole, if he was breached, he'd be back in for years, and there's a big chance of being caught. So now if he does get to walk out, there's nothing they can do.
And so if he walks out, can he literally go and live anywhere?
At this stage, yes.
Wow.
That's a major problem that they have I think we need to have with convicted pedophiles, and especially repeat pedophiles, after 2 offences, that's it, you can't go out. You shouldn't be released, because there are bank robbers that stop robbing. There are a lot of people who've killed over murderers who it's because of a situation and they're not going to go and do it. Again, there are some. But with the pedophiles, it's almost invariable that they're going to do it again. I spoke to a criminal psychologist, Watson Munro, and he said the targets are everywhere. They're prey. Just driving down the street, they will see children, and they just keep wanting to do it. And he said it's very, very, very rare that you'll have a pedophile that will turn his life around. And a lot of them don't want to. The pleasure that they get, it's like a drug and like a narcotic for them.
And a lot of them don't have to because they don't get caught, so why would
That's
you?
right.
And the impact of those sorts of acts on children are so immeasurable and literally, destroy lives in this case. But also one of the other girls who was there, as you say, is now part of that petition, and her life has been irreparably damaged.
That's right. And then she is fighting really hard. And what happens a lot of the time with sexual abuse cases, particularly, is by the time they come and start telling what happened to them, the victims, they have had horrible lives. They've ended up being drug addicts. So they're not very good witnesses. So the pedophile gets them all over again, because half the time they get into the witness box and they're not very good. They've had drug problems. They've been in jail. And it's because of what's happened to them. So it's like they get them again. It's a double protection. They get them not to tell what's been going on, like Guida didn't tell, that they're too scared to say anything. And then eventually when they do, a lot of the times I said they've had such fractured lives, witnesses go, oh, they've been on drugs and, it's horrible. They win again,
And I believe one of the girls who was with Samantha Knight when the offence happened actually told her mother, and her mother didn't
do
report
anything,
it, which you just must look back on that and go, what a difference it could have made if she'd just said something.
Could have stopped him.
Exactly right.
And as I said, we don't know. You got to remember, though, again, nowadays you would be able to track somebody from their phone records, their bank accounts, whereas back then, the freedom to move around, people can get away with a lot more. So, and all the records would be probably ruined. The courts, they're going to struggle unless some sort of legislation is passed very, very quickly. But I don't know whether it's going to be in time to stop Michael Guida from not being released.
No, exactly right. And that's, I think, a story we've got to watch very closely in the coming weeks, because that's pretty terrifying. And as you say, the probability of him reoffending
is incredibly high. And although with that you'll find vigilante justice sometimes. There's got to be. Dennis Ferguson was a pedophile and he moved to Sydney, but every time he moved somewhere we would get a tip-off and we would be there and he'd have to move. His life was hell. Well,
and that's because
who cares? Because
and people recognised his face from the media.
And Michael Guida is not going to be hard to miss.
Yeah.
So I'd hope that every time he goes somewhere, we get a phone call, and I think en masse that we just go there, and he'll have to move. And his life will be in danger because there are people who, rightly or wrongly, will want to hurt him.
Yeah.
Just people totally unrelated. That would be poetic justice, I think,
Yeah, and he's not someone you want moving in next door if you've got kids around. So.
No, but what do you do? That's the other problem. What neighbourhood is going to have a convicted pedophile? Because, as I said, we know that they just tend to repeat and repeat and repeat. Full-time monitoring, bracelets would be another thing we maybe have to do until they can absolutely prove and satisfy a range of experts. A lot of the time they're given medication and they just don't take it. They don't want to be cured at all. They like what they do. They don't even see it as wrong. You even get some of the perverse people that say, I just love young children. The big danger here is if a person has finished their sentence, they just walk out.
Yeah.
Sometimes, as hard as it is to swallow, to say, well, let them go out a year earlier so we can monitor them, and they'll do something. We'll get them for something.
Yeah.
And that's why they do it. So I know they cop a lot of flack, that parole board, especially sometimes at the hands of us and Telegraph and other media organisations. But there is sometimes that is their thinking. Well, let's give him parole and we can monitor him. But Guida didn't even go for it. He didn't even turn up at his parole hearing.
I'd never heard of it like that. It's a very interesting idea that it would be more advantageous.
For him, it is.
Yeah, exactly
he goes,
right.
I can get out a year or 2 years early, have these guys all over me. I've done 15 years. I might as well just do another year, and then I walk out of here and they can't get me. But as I said, looking at him, he's not going to be able to blend into the community very easily because, as I said, I think the photos you've seen, he's put on even more weight since. Apparently he really is obese. So we can only hope. And that's when people see him, they ring and he gets run out of town after town. So,
exactly right.
Because of what he's done.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. That's, it's such an important story and your insight is invaluable. Thank you for that.
That's all right. Thank you for having me.
Now he's changed his story and claims that he had no involvement in Samantha's death. What that raises for me is his fitness to be released. He's pled guilty. There's evidence that demonstrates his involvement in Samantha's death. He takes so little responsibility that he now denies it. That's hugely alarming.
Since the recording of this interview, we're still waiting to hear if Michael Guida will be released from prison. He has still not disclosed any more details about the location of Samantha's body, despite his brother making public statements to the contrary. You can find Mark Morri's true crime writing, including his book on the disappearance of Anita Cobby, in the description of this episode. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast, hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Our senior producer and editor is Elise Cooper. For discussions on this episode, you can join our True Crime Conversations group on Facebook. Just search True Crime Conversations or click through on the link in the description of this episode.